struck down and replaced with.
I think the repeal was more political because that was a legislation with the BJP government, and the new government, which was political. They said in manifesto that the first thing they do is repeal the legislation. That's the first thing they do.
What they have now is just this.
Yeah, and so the same government, the Congress UPA government, introduced the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act after the Bombay thing, which is basically the same thing.
Incorporated, that is temporary measure. Quota was a temporary measure. That was done away with, and this permanent law, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, provisions of quota were lifted and put in this. So this is a permanent law for all time. So whenever there is a terrorist activity or extremist activity, whoever does it, so this is going to be there for much longer. Now, but at the same time, there is when you were talking of your research work, there are similarities in England and India, and they are dissimilar. Minorities are immigrants in UK, but they are not immigrants in India. Therefore, under the normative system, they are citizens of this country like any other. They are not. They cannot be treated differently. The norm says that, but there is a great variation between the norm and the practice. Though Criminal Tribes Act has been abolished, but the practice that they are discriminated stays. But normatively, they are like any other citizen of this country. So, but therefore, you will have to be very sort of discreet when you are comparing UK or England and India. They are not the same. Here you have to take into account the territory and the constitution. Pre-constitution position has changed after the impact of the constitution. That is after 1950. And things have changed. All citizens who are born here, live here, irrespective of religion, are citizens and they have equal rights. Gender have equal rights. Though there are variations, there are violations of this sacred core principle. But that is at the practice level. That is when you go into sociology of arrest. Sociology of arrest is very different. But the norm of arrest is different. Norm of rights is different. They are uniform to that individual. So that has a variation from England. In England that might not be there. All immigrants are treated alike. Some treated more.
Yeah, well in England I've been looking at second generation Asians.
But second generation Asians also do not become English. They do not become.
But they're British.
They are British. They have a passport. That is a political fact. But sociology, they are all. I have seen that.
No, absolutely. They're the kind of nuances that I need to understand much more carefully.
The constitutional context to that is this whole preventive detention is problematic because the Constitution has explicitly allowed for preventive detention. So there's a huge provision on the Constitution itself authorizes Article 22. It's a very strange constitution in that sense. That it's very rare to find a constitution which allows such elaborate provisions on preventive detention.
I wonder if before we break for lunch, I could just make a clarification really. It's slightly awkward, but Professor Pandey has expressed a little bit of surprise at the range of papers. And I've been wondering, the fact is that when I first met with Professor Rao, we talked about a workshop on how we do empirical research. So the raison d'etre for this had been that in India, you as a law school were not so experienced and developed in terms of doing empirical research. We as a Centre for Criminology were. So my remit was initially, and and I understood it always to be that way, to devise a programme from Oxford, at least, our contributions, which would be how we address the substantive issues that we care about, that we feel are important, from our different empirical perspectives. And so we wrote papers on that remit, and so the papers you're having from us are focused on that. How do we take these very different and disparate substantive topics and address them empirically? I noticed only the title, which was When Criminal Justice Goes Wrong, perhaps a week ago, so I don't know when that was put on, but I think there was perhaps, as is often the case when you try to organise these things across continents, let alone towns or countries, a breakdown in communication, and it doesn't matter where that came from or how it came about, but the fact is we had come with the idea of having a research workshop on how we do empirical research, bringing our substantive issues. And we tried, once we saw the title this morning, to weave, and I think there are very important connections, and I think our discussants and the questions that come from all of us have reflected that, but that, I think, is the source of why we're coming with these different projects, because we didn't know that we were not meant to be.
No.
So apologies if it's caused confusion.
Collaborative exercise. That is what I said. That is the beauty of collaborative exercise.
Absolutely,
When
absolutely.
people,
Embrace it.
On the same areas, we
Yeah.
might have different ideas.
Yes.
And we may benefit still. But how to make this
And to maybe pull
exercise
together.
most effective, that is my anxiety.
Mm.
Worry. And I think I will help us out in this core and periphery. Carol will help us out because that is the post-lunch. We have
Post-lunch we will do
go
that.
about
We will do that.
a little half an hour we talk on this
Yes.
as to how do we save the situation now. Wherever we have left this has to be saved, the situation. We have to save it from Meaning's defeat. Which is the law.
We'll let you do that. Thank you all very much for very good questions and comments.
They readjust mid-flight so you actually arrive on time. So we have an hour between now and the tea break, in which we have 3 speakers. We'll then pause for half an hour and we'll have another hour of discussion after those 3 speakers. So I'll introduce them in turn. Our first speaker is Dr. Anna Surendranath from this university, whose topic is When the Death Penalty Goes Wrong. So we have 15 minutes, which I shall strictly enforce. You have 20 now, actually. Well, all right, you're on the case, aren't you? Yeah, you have 20.
Good afternoon, everyone. What I'll be talking to you today about is the death penalty research project that we've been doing here since June 2013. It's India's first empirical study on the death penalty, and the task of the project in the last 17-18 months has been to interview all of India's death row prisoners, their families, and their trial court lawyers, which is what we've completed now, and so we're in the second month of our statistical analysis of what we have found. The project was in collaboration with the National Legal Services Authority, which is the apex body for providing legal aid services, and was then authorized by Justice Satasivam, who then went on to become the Chief Justice of India and delivered a landmark judgment on the death penalty a few months before he retired. Now, in terms of the existing body of work on the death penalty in India, you will see that most of the work involves analysis of judgments. In that sense, it's critiquing judgments. There's hardly any work on understanding who India's death row prisoners are in terms of their socioeconomic profile, or even understanding the legal processes involved or social processes in how the death penalty is imposed in this country. And that was sort of the basic task with which we set out is to develop a socio-economic profile of India's death row prisoners and map their interaction with the criminal justice system at the trial stage, at the investigation, evidence gathering, trial, sentencing, appellate procedures, access to legal counsel, and the mercy petition stage. So, in that sense, what we're doing is not, I think, is very basic foundational work, which we hope will then be used to more nuanced and complex analysis of the death penalty, the administration of the death penalty in India. The methodology we've adopted was that in consultation with academics, lawyers and judges who have sort of a keen interest in this issue, we developed 3 different questionnaires for the prisoners, for the families and the trial court defense lawyers, which then we've, and the members of the project explicitly instructed not to administer the questionnaire in that sense, and was to develop conversation with the interviewees and keep the questionnaire as a guideline in terms of the kind of information we wanted. Over the course of past 18 months, we've used student researchers from this university. We've had about, in sum total, about 80 student researchers over this course of 18 months, and at any given point of time, we had about 30 to 35 researchers with us. In terms of and I just quickly take you through the brief that I was given was to talk to you about the challenges of doing this kind of research in India, and also then sort of outline the more substantive issues of what is wrong with the administration of death penalty. So I'll quickly take you through the challenges that we've faced of doing this kind of research. So as I said, this required us to know who India's death penalty prisoners are, where are they lodged. We needed to know where their families lived, and also we needed to track down their lawyers. It's given the way things operate in India, the death penalty is sort of centrally imposed, so death penalty operates across India. So states don't really, it's an unexplored issue whether any one state constitutionally, it's yet unexplored whether any one state can say we don't want the death penalty. So it's administered nationally. Death row prisoners are lodged, and law and order is a state subject. Prisons are a state subject. And in that sense, death row prisoners are lodged all over the country and across 28 states. There are some states in which there were no death row prisoners, and we've covered about 20 of these 28 states. The other 8 don't have any death row prisoners. So permission to access prisoners was a huge problem. I think even before we could apply for permission, we didn't know. There's no exact number of the number of India's death row prisoners. There's the National Crime Records Bureau, which releases data annually, but it was very clear very early on that data is not accurate. It is not disaggregated enough. And in each state, also they're not kept, they're not lodged in any one prison. There could be multiple prisons where they're lodged. So we needed to find out the actual disaggregated data of where the death row prisoners were lodged. So we had to write to each state, ask for permission, ask for data, follow it up, and working with the National Legal Service Authority gave us a lot of support, in the sense that initially we were worried that whether there would be interference, because the National Legal Service Authority is funded by the state. It's administered by the judiciary in that sense. There's no complete separation between legal aid and the judges in that sense. It's administered by the judges at the top. But they've been very helpful. They've stayed out of the study in any sort of, they haven't really interfered. And all that they've really done is send out the letters that we wanted them to send out. So that's how we got the permissions. Data has been a huge problem. Even when the prison department in each of these states sent us what they thought were the existing number of death row prisoners and who they were and which jail they were lodged, in the first month of the study itself, we realized that the data is not accurate, it's not up to date, and that the only way of confirming that data is to go to each jail in each of these states and ask them if there are death row prisoners, right? So the exact number is one issue. Then who are the death row prisoners? And they were not able to capture the change in status because the death penalty in India, once you're awarded the death sentence by the trial court, it has to necessarily be confirmed by the High Court, and then the Supreme Court may or may not hear your appeal, which I'll come back to later. One thing that we really faced as part of having to take permissions from 20 different prison departments in each of the states was the conditions imposed on us were very different across states. Most particularly in terms of impact of the study was some states made it very clear that all interviews would be not under the supervision, but at least in the presence of a prison official, of at least a prison guard. Which we sort of, in some cases where that condition was imposed, we managed to negotiate it with the individual prison authorities saying, you know what, this is going to take really long, do you really want to stay there? You know, this is going to take about 3 hours per prisoner. So you made it seem really like a boring, long task, and they would be happy to just go away after the first 10 minutes. So that sort of individual prison negotiation happened, but there were some prisons that enforced it very, very strictly. There are some prisons where then the prison official would feel the need to contribute to the interview in terms of when a question was asked to the prisoner, you know, would want to provide, and it was mainly men who were there, would provide their feedback on the question that you've asked to the prisoner. In terms of, and I think in cases, in certain sensitive cases, we did feel that the presence of a prison official or a prison guard did really affect the conversation we were having and kind of willingness with which they were willing to talk to us. But anyway, and in terms of the information we were looking for, as I said, we're looking for socioeconomic data in terms of caste, religion, age, occupation, income, landholding, criminal background, and that's something that we really found in terms of what is their prior criminal history, right? In terms of that construction of the most deviant, evil mind does not really play out. Most of them are turned out to be first-time offenders in that sense. In terms of challenges during the prisoner interviews, the biggest challenge I would say was engaging with the prisoner on a conversation about the innocence of guilt. The project was very clear that was not of any interest to us. But when you go there, it's inevitable that the prisoner wants to talk about innocence or guilt. Even if they admit to have done the crime, they want to explain as to why they did it, the circumstances that led to it. And at that point, we found it really, and it's a very small group of us who were doing the prison interviews, whereas the group was much larger for the family interviews. We found it really difficult to stop that narrative or say, we're not interested in that information. And we realized that they had never had really the chance even to talk to their lawyer in the kind of detail that they were talking to us. And here we're talking about 2 hours to 3 hours, or maybe depending on how willing they were to talk to us. And that they really wanted to get their narrative out there, right? And we were seen as people who were coming from Delhi with the capability of, or their imagined capability of us being able to help them in their cases. And even though it was made explicitly very clear that it is a research project, there can be nothing that can be done, you never really get over that barrier, because for them, you've come from the capital city, you have the ability to access institutions that they can't, and they expect something to be done, right? So that is certainly a difficulty that we faced. And I think more than anything else, it was a moral dilemma to how much to force the conversation back onto the track onto which that we wanted information, right? And I think that yes, it's just played out very differently across all these interviews. Some people understood what we were trying to do. For certain people, it was just a plea for help. For certain people, it was just asking us to get back in touch with their family and ask their family to come and meet them. So the whole range of things, and in that sense, that moral dilemma of whether we were ending up using them for our own purposes, and I guess it's that sort of concern would be central to a study like this, is something that we've had to grapple with. How willing were prisoners to talk to us? I think a crucial function of that was depending on which stage of the death penalty process they were, whether they were at the trial stage, or whether the High Court stage, or whether the Supreme Court, or the mercy has been dismissed and they're just awaiting execution. I think there's a strong, I wouldn't say there's an exact causal link in terms of that, but we did find that prisoners who were who'd been sentenced to death only at the first stage and had many stages to go were more hopeful in that sense, hopeful in the sense of they kept saying that they were so confident that the High Court would let them off, that at least they would get off the death penalty. And in that sense, where I would also say we're quite dismissive of what we could, of the importance of the study, whereas the ones, the prisoners whose mercy had been rejected by the president and there was no real remedy left, right, knew that, I mean, viewed us as some sort of last roll of the dice, right, and in that sense, there's this constant invocation of, oh, you know, God has sent you people, right, there's this constant helplessness that played out through us in these interviews. Another thing that we faced in terms of talking to prisoners about their socio-economic condition of their families is very, very interesting, the disconnect between what they believe to be the truth and what is the truth. And we could contrast that because when we went and met the families, it was not really what the prisoner believed to be. And I'm not, again, none of these are absolute claims in that sense. And there's a serious issue of that disconnect, and this applied only where families were actually coming and meeting the prisoners. There was a large number of cases where the family has abandoned the prisoner. They don't want anything to do and have refused to give us interviews because these are cases that this is part of their life that they're done with and don't want anybody to rake up. They live in anonymity in the locations that they live in, and us going around asking, because we have to go and ask people in the locality, oh, do you know this person's house? Actually was a serious concern that was flagged very early on with some of the cases we did, that we had to be very careful not to compromise anonymity because it's all very socially sensitive cases. It could be rape and murder of a child, which has caused massive social stigma to the family, and that's something that we had to deal with through the limitation of the model that we built. Obviously was that it was a single interview model, right? We went there, we just had one interview and that was it. We had the conversation we tried getting the information as much as we could from the questionnaire. And in the interviews that we had the chances to go back and interview them for whatever reason, we needed more information or there was something that we needed to clarify for their cases. We felt that the rapport was certainly built much more in the subsequent interviews, and I think given what we were trying to do in terms of the aim, I really don't think it would be feasible for us to allow for multiple interview sessions of each prisoner, because we would be given permissions only for a set number of days, for set number of hours each day, and to fit in all of that into that really did not give us the opportunity to have multiple interview sessions. Challenges for the family interviews, I would say that just finding them was a huge problem, right? The addresses that are maintained in official records are not accurate, are not accurate. So finding them, it led us to a lot of complicated situations where there are hostile situations in the village. The family is under constant threat from their neighbors. The family interviews are mainly led by student researchers, with huge learning curve for them in terms of how to deal with those kind of situations, and the family. I guess the desperation is much more, and then the students had to learn how to deal with that and sort of make it very clear to them that we're not there to fight their legal case, and that was not the agenda, right? Massive problems with documenting and archiving of material. I would say it's a full-blown crisis in terms of if death row prisoners at any point want to access the case materials. It's extremely difficult. It's proven extremely difficult for us to build a database of these case records and maintain their trial court judgments, which we've been trying to do. And in terms of, and even if you went through the official process of getting it by paying official fees, it's very, very expensive. To get a full case record of a case that has gone up until the mercy stage and has gone back to the trial court, the sentencing court, costs you about anywhere between 8,000 to 10,000 rupees, and that's just an official fee without us having to bribe anybody, right? Have we bribed people? We have to get the records, because some cases were just too urgent to wait for 2 weeks to get the papers out, right? If the president has rejected the mercy, the black warrant has been issued, I mean, there's no point waiting for 2 weeks to get the case record out, right? In terms of the wrongness of the process, I would say that, and we've been asked repeatedly as to why this wrongness of the process matters. Doesn't it influence the entire understanding of criminal justice as such, in the sense that doesn't it apply to all other prisoners and not just death row prisoners? And I would say that the response to that is simply this, that while all of the issues that I have outlined, be police investigation, access to legal representation, or niche of lawyering, would be true for any prisoner within the Indian criminal justice system. I think if you really understood the way the death penalty affects a prisoner lodged in an Indian prison, I do believe that the death penalty is a special punishment amongst other punishments. But more so, the experience of being on death row in India is crucial to understanding why these processes. You cannot be relying on these processes to subject someone to the death penalty in India. And you would see that the number of executions in the last 2 decades is very, very low. In the sense, we don't see the kind of numbers that you see in China or even the United States. But I think we miss, and I think there's been a huge problem in death penalty, the anti-death penalty movement in India. That there's no movement because people are not getting executed. But framing it like that misses the point, right? It misses the point of the experience of being on death penalty in an Indian prison, right? And that, I think, in the socioeconomic conditions that we operate in, that experience is what makes it so inhuman. Irrespective of whether after 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, they're not executed and they're commuted. I don't think that makes a difference. And just concentrating on that is hugely problematic. Police investigation. One case, there is a serious case of exculpatory evidence being held back. Torture is rampant. Confessions that are gotten out, even though the law says the confession is inadmissible, the Evidence Act allows that part of the confession that allows recovery of evidence into courts, and that is massively misused. There is no discussion. Most of the recoveries in these cases are based on such confessions. Even though the confession is admissible, they torture the prisoners. The accused get the confession out, or they plant evidence and stage the recovery. They have their own witnesses. They stage the recovery, or they do the recovery based on custodial violence, and then that evidence becomes admissible in court. Access to legal representation, we found it quite contrary to and sort of intuitions around this. Mostly prisoners, a much larger proportion of prisoners access private lawyers at the preliminary stage, at the trial court stage. But the kind of private lawyers they were accessing were of extremely low quality. The fees that they had to pay was very, very, it's pay 100 rupees or 200 rupees per appearance, whereas the leading lawyer in that court would be charging about 8,000 or 9,000 rupees per appearance. So the quality of lawyering, even though it was private lawyering, was quite at the bottom end of the spectrum. And if I may just say something about the nature of criminal practice, and I think a lot of it is what was sort of Carolyn was referring to in the context of the commission, was that lawyers only respond to papers. In that sense, that's all they use. They don't talk to the prisoner. They don't go and have sessions with the prisoners to find out what is the alibi or what was the age. So if, like in some of the cases we're doing now in the Supreme Court, which has gone through the entire stage, mercy has been denied. And when we interviewed them, we found out that the age mentioned is incorrect. During the entire proceedings, the age was considered to be about 25, whereas the prisoner's age is actually 18 years. At the time of the incident was 18 years and 1 month, which is just above the age of juveniles. Right? So we had to go back and get all the case papers that proved his age, and the court is hearing that now. During the same case, there's a serious flaw in the test identification parade. The case was that there were 2 Sikhs with a turban, with not the full, but just the amount of hair here tied. In the test identification parade, which was, and it was a child witness and the only witness in the case. In the test identification parade, they put only 2 Sikhs there, right? So the police were saying that there were 2 Sikhs, and in the test identification, the girl was saying that her testimony was there were 2 Sikhs who had the amount of hair. And in the test identification parade, the police has produced on 10 people, but of those 10 people, only 2 are Sikhs. And the 2 are who they are accusing of having committed the offense. And the girl picks out the 2 of them, right? And in the case, and now mercy has been rejected. And now when we took it back to court now and saying you can't, A, his age is wrong, B, he was picked out of such a lineup, right? The court, and you can see why the court, you can see why the court will not admit to it, right? The court, they heard the counsel that we had for a very long time and did not order a rehearing on merits. So as of now, it's only a rehearing on sentence using the age factor, but the whole testing of the test identification parade will be challenged. They said it's too late to challenge it. And I think that's a tragedy of the system, that you're relying on lawyers and lawyering at the bottom that is completely ineffective, right? And you can't be using that system to sentence people to death on that basis. And the problem with death penalty movement, the death penalty movement in India is the attention is focused only when mercy is rejected and everything is done. You can't go back to the trial record. You can't go back to the evidence that has been recorded, but you're stuck with all of that, right? And that's the problem. Is my time out? Okay. There are lots of other things I wanted to say about the substantive issues, but I'll just finish with one example and to show you why there is a huge breakdown in this entire thing. This is, and I'll take his name because he would have absolutely no issue with me taking a name and wants the story to be told as often as possible. Dharampal is in a jail in Ambala, which is a neighboring state of Haryana. Dharampal is convicted and sentenced to death for killing a family of 5, and mercy is rejected. And the case is that the daughter in that family had accused him of rape, and he had threatened her, and he'd gone to jail for that, and he had threatened her saying that if you don't withdraw the case, I will come back and kill your family. But despite that, the girl goes ahead and gives the evidence, and the family supports her, and Dharampal is sent to jail. He gets out on bail after he's sentenced, he's convicted of the rape in the trial court, and he's sent out on bail. He comes out and he kills the family, right? He comes out and kills the family, and so it's for that case, for killing of the family, that he's given death, right? Now this case goes through the entire system, right? Trial court gives him death, High Court confirms that, Supreme Court gives him death, mercy is rejected. But somewhere between the Supreme Court confirming his death sentence and the President rejecting his mercy, he's acquitted of the rape, right? He's acquitted in the rape case, right? But there is nothing in the system, because the system treats these as completely two individual cases. There's nothing in the system to inform the President, right? Yes, it may not acquit him of the 5 murders, but clearly it's a very relevant sentencing factor, right? Right? And there is nothing in the system to inform the President about this, right? And the President rejects his mercy, right? And then they don't execute him for whatever reason for 6-7 years after that. And now the case is now in the Punjab and Haryana High Court on this matter, that his sentence must. So it's just a great matter of luck as to which prisoner we found, what stories we found, whether they were willing to talk to us on that day, right? And even though we entered the research with a very specific agenda that we would not get into litigation, right? It would just be inhumane for the kind of stories we heard not to translate that research into the cases that we have helped institute, and we continue to support. We've got lawyers who argue these cases, and we support them with a lot of research and documents and all of that. There are a lot of substantive points of the process itself and of evidentiary issues, and I hope I'll have the chance to take some of that during discussion.